Hi everyone, Dean here from the Protocase team. Today I'm going to show you how you can save time by grouping objects, even components in Protocase Designer, and saving them to your personal library. Protocase Designer is our free CAD software. We've built it in a way to make it as easy as possible for you to design custom enclosures, panels, and brackets to your exact specifications, and then quote and order your design quickly. There's so many ways to streamline your designing in Protocase Designer. One of those ways is to use the grouping tool to group together common objects. Not only can you group objects, but you can also save that grouped assembly to your personal library as a single entity. Let's go through how. First up, we should define what an object is. In Protocase Designer, anything that you place on your design is considered an object. That includes cutouts, graphics, masking, exclusion zones, fasteners, and even hardware like handles, rubber feet, and components. Protocase Designer has an entire category in the library devoted to components, like circuit boards, connectors, fans, power supplies, heat sinks, and more. Plus you can import step files of any components you're designing your enclosure around. So, all of those items I talked about, they're objects, which means that in Protocase Designer, you can group objects together and move them as one single item. And once you've created a group of objects, you can save that grouping to your personal library. This is really helpful if you have things like the layout of boards and fasteners that you'll frequently use, or cutout and graphic combinations that you'll be using in other designs. Alright, so here I have a Rackmount design already created. What I'm going to do is open my library manager and go to my personal library. I'm going to place an ATX motherboard as I mentioned before, and just place this anywhere on my enclosure. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to place the fasteners, and by that I mean the standoff that I'll be using in order to mount this motherboard to the enclosure. So I'm just making sure all of the standoffs here are aligned with the holes to make sure that when placed that the motherboard is going to be able to be attached to the enclosure. So I've already placed my ATX motherboard and the mating standoffs for it. So what I'm going to do now is place a couple of Raspberry Pis, as I mentioned before. So what I'm going to do is make sure that these are aligned where they should be by selecting both the edges of these motherboards. Now, we have this component as I would like it to be in my assembly, and in multiple assemblies that I'll be using. So what I'm going to do, select all of these components in Move Item mode as I mentioned, and group them together. Now I have a group that I can just move around and place as I want, since I know that all of these components grouped together are as I want them to be. So as I mentioned, you can now select that group of components and add to your library. As discussed in the video, you'll want to make sure that you're pretty descriptive in what you name them, just so if you're going to have multiple of these grouped assemblies, you're able to differentiate them from one another. So I'm going to name this grouped set of boards. And in the description, I'm going to put ATX motherboard and 2 Raspberry Pis. Now, just to show you, I'll actually remove this assembly entirely, open up the library manager again, go back to my personal library, and as you can see, there is now a grouped set of boards, which is what I had named that assembly, which I'll take and place onto my enclosure. This is a huge time saver, as now I don't have to make sure that all these components are going to be placed in the proper locations. So, as you can see, I now have a grouped assembly of components that I can just place at one time without having to worry about where all those components are going to be in reference to one another. So I make sure my X and Y value are now correct. And that's it. To make a dad pun here, easy as pie. And there you have it. You can now see that all my components are shown in the assembly, as well as their mating fasteners that I had mentioned. This makes designing much more easier rather than having to do this every single time you try to create a design. The sky's the limit, and the possibilities are endless. That covers everything you need to know about grouping objects in Protocase Designer. I hope it'll help save time in your designing. Download the latest version of Protocase Designer at protocasedesigner.com if you haven't already. If you have any questions about using Protocase Designer, make sure to reach out. Comment below, email info@protocase.com, or check out the Protocase Designer forums. Thank you for watching this week's Protocase Tech Tip. Our team will be back next week with a new one.